The night the sky turned red over St. Helena Parish, they say you could smell the burning sugar and old timber all the way in Baton Rouge. It was October 15, 1853. The Beaumont estate, a sprawling monument to American aristocracy, a white-pillared temple of power that had stood for 3 decades, was screaming. The fire didn't just burn, it devoured. It roared through the east wing like a living thing, snapping 100-year-old oak beams as if they were matchsticks, melting the imported French crystal chandeliers until they rained down like liquid diamonds. And in the center of that inferno, trapped in the very study where he had signed death warrants and purchased human souls, was Governor Charles Beaumont. They say he didn't scream. They say he died as he lived, cold, hard, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness, even as the roof caved in to crush him. But this story isn't about the fire. The fire was just the ending. The fire was the mercy. No, the real story, the terror that birthed the flames, began 6 years earlier. It didn't start with a scream, but with a silence. It started with a glance, stolen in a dusty stable, that violated the most sacred and brutal laws of the South. It is a story of a love so forbidden that the mere thought of it was a crime punishable by death. A story of a governor's wife who was a prisoner in silk, and a man who was a prisoner in chains, and what happened when they realized that the only way to be free was to burn the world down. Before we descend into the suffocating heat of the Louisiana bayou and peel back the layers of this forgotten tragedy, I need to know who is walking into the dark with us tonight. I want to see the map of our legion light up. In the comments down below, tell me right now, which state or city are you watching from? Are you safe in the Pacific Northwest? Are you watching from the deep South, perhaps not far from where these ruins still lie? Let me know where you are. Now take a breath. The air is about to get heavy. Let's go back to 1847. Summer in Louisiana is not a season. It is a physical assault. That year, it arrived like a fever that refused to break. The air was thick, gelatinous, clinging to your skin the moment you stepped out of the shade. It smelled of sweet magnolia, jasmine, and the wet, black rot of the swamp, a perfume that masked the decay festering just beneath the soil. In the parish of St. Helena, the Beaumont estate rose from the earth like a challenge to God. It was perfect, terrifyingly perfect. 20,000 acres of cotton that stretched to the vanishing point, a sea of white bowls bobbing in the heat, harvested by 300 souls held in bondage. The mansion itself was a cathedral of southern excess. White columns that looked like the bones of giants. Marble floors imported from Italy that clicked cold under the heels of boots. 12 bedrooms, filled with furniture carved from mahogany and rosewood, draped in velvets that cost more than a human life. And inside this palace, ruling over it with a hand of iron and ice, was Governor Charles Beaumont. To understand the horror of what comes next, you must understand Charles. He was 57 years old, a man whose face seemed carved from limestone, sharp, pale, and unyielding. He was not a man who shouted. He was a man who whispered and people trembled. His political career was built on the pillars of civilization and order. He spoke of progress in the capital, while back home, his wealth dripped with the blood of the men and women who broke their backs in his fields. He loved his plantation. He loved the geometry of it, the straight lines of the crops, the ledger books where he recorded profits and losses, the list of stock, horses, cattle, and people, all written in the same neat, cursive hand. And he loved his wife, Eleanor, in exactly the same way. Eleanor Beaumont was 32 years old, and she was the most beautiful object Charles owned. That is how he saw her, not as a partner, but as a reflection of his own success. She was a vision rendered in silk, lace, and pearls. Her blonde hair was always pinned in a complex, flawless arrangement, never a strand out of place. Her posture was a study in aristocratic grace, her spine stiffened by whalebone corsets and years of training. From the outside, Eleanor was the envy of every woman from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. She was the governor's lady. She presided over tea in the parlor, pouring from silver pots, smiling that practiced, porcelain smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was admired without being known, loved without being touched. But the truth, Eleanor Beaumont was dying, not in her body but in her soul. She was suffocating in plain sight. Her life was a performance, a play that never ended. She had been sold to Charles when she was 17 by a father who needed political favors, a transaction as cold as any slave auction, though wrapped in the finery of a wedding. For 15 years she had been a decoration, a doll in a glass case. She slept in a separate wing from her husband. They dined at opposite ends of a 30-foot table. Their conversations were scripted exchanges about the weather, the crops, and upcoming social galas. She walked the marble halls of that 12-bedroom mansion and felt like a ghost haunting her own life. She had everything a woman was supposed to want, and she was starving. Then came the morning in late May. The heat hadn't yet reached its midday violence. The sun was just a pale bruise on the horizon, filtering through the Spanish moss that draped the oaks like torn rags. Eleanor was restless. A strange, vibrating anxiety had woken her before dawn. She couldn't breathe in her room. The silk sheets felt like shrouds. She dressed quickly without a maid, a small rebellion, and went outside. Usually, Eleanor's world was confined to the front of the house, the rose gardens, the verandas, the parlors. The working parts of the estate were invisible to her, hidden behind hedgerows and distance. But that morning, drawn by a magnetism she couldn't name, she walked past the manicured hedges. She walked past the smokehouse. She walked toward the stables. The air here was different. It smelled of hay, of manure, of hot iron and honest sweat. It was real. It was gritty. She stepped into the cool, dim interior of the main barn. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the slat walls. The sound of a hammer ringing against metal echoed in the space. Clang, 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 rhythmic and hypnotic. A man was shoeing a horse in the far stall. He was focused on his work, his back to her. Eleanor stood frozen, watching him. He was tall, over 6 feet, with a back broad and sculpted by a lifetime of labor that would have broken lesser men. He wore a rough shirt soaked through with sweat, the fabric clinging to skin the color of the Louisiana earth after a heavy rain. She should have turned around. She should have cleared her throat and demanded attention. She was the mistress of this estate. He was property. Item number 47 in the ledger, acquired in 1839 for $800. But she didn't speak. She just watched. She watched the way his muscles moved under his skin as he manipulated the heavy hoof of the thoroughbred. She watched the way he murmured to the animal, a low, rumbling baritone that carried no fear, no anger, only a quiet, commanding strength. Then the horse shifted. The man paused. He sensed eyes on him. He turned. His name was Elijah. He was 30 years old. And in that moment, the history of the Beaumont estate pivoted. Elijah didn't look down. That was the first thing Eleanor noticed, and it sent a shock of cold fear and thrill through her veins. In 1847, an enslaved man was trained from birth to lower his eyes before a white woman, to make himself small, to perform submission. It was a survival mechanism, a way to say, I am not a threat, I am not a man, I am a thing. Elijah did not lower his eyes. He looked at her, directly. He looked her in the face for 3 seconds that stretched into an eternity. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and startlingly weary. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the bottom of the well and was still standing. There was no defiance in them, but there was no submission either. There was just recognition. He saw her, not the dress, not the title, not the dangerous power she held over his life. He saw the woman standing in the straw, pale and trembling. Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, a sensation so sharp she almost gasped. It was the sound of a seal breaking, a wall crumbling. "You," she whispered. The word barely had any breath behind it. He didn't move. He held a hammer in one hand, the horse's hoof resting on his thigh. "What is your name?" she asked. The silence that followed was heavy, loaded with 100 years of violence. For him to speak to her like a man was danger. For her to ask was madness. "Elijah." "Ma'am," he said. His voice was rough, textured like gravel. "Elijah," she repeated. The name tasted strange in her mouth, biblical, heavy. It felt like a prayer and a blasphemy all at once. He nodded once slowly, and then, as if realizing the immense danger of the moment, he turned back to the horse. He broke the connection. He picked up the shoe, raised the hammer, and the rhythmic clang, clang, clang resumed. Eleanor stood there for another minute, her heart thundering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at his hands, rough, scarred, capable, and then looked at her own hands encased in delicate lace gloves. The contrast made her dizzy. She turned and fled. She walked quickly back to the main house, her skirts rustling, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She felt as though she had just touched a live wire. She went to her room, locked the door, and sat at her vanity, staring at herself in the mirror. But she didn't see the governor's wife. She saw the woman Elijah had looked at. That night, Eleanor couldn't eat. She sat at the long mahogany table, pushing peas around her plate with a silver fork. Charles sat at the other end, reading a dispatch from Washington, ignoring her completely. "The cotton yield looks promising this quarter," Charles said without looking up. "Though the heat may bring the blight, I've ordered coal to increase the shifts. We need the harvest in before the storms." Eleanor looked at her husband. She looked at his pale, manicured hands holding the paper, hands that had never done a day's labor, hands that signed papers that tore families apart. "Yes, Charles," she said. Her voice sounded hollow to her own ears. "Are you unwell, Eleanor?" He glanced at her then, his eyes cold and assessing, like he was inspecting a piece of furniture for scratches. "You look flushed." "It's just the heat," she lied. "The air is very heavy today." "Stay indoors tomorrow," he commanded, returning to his paper. "It does not do for you to be seen swooning." She lay in bed that night beside his snoring form. He occasionally visited her room, a duty performed with mechanical indifference, and she stared at the darkness. She closed her eyes and saw the stable. She smelled the iron and the hay. She saw Elijah's eyes. It should have ended there. In any rational world, in any story with sense and safety, Eleanor Beaumont would have buried that moment deep inside her. She would have returned to her needlepoint, her tea parties, and her slow, suffocating death. Elijah would have remained a shadow in the background, a tool of the estate. But the human heart is a traitor, and some hungers, once awakened, cannot be starved back into silence. 3 days later, Eleanor was back in the rose garden. It was early, the sun just bleeding over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. She told herself she was just walking. She told herself she needed the air. But she walked to the far edge of the garden, the place where the manicured beauty of the white roses met the rougher, wilder edge of the grounds. He was there. Elijah was pruning the bushes. His presence wasn't an accident. On a plantation, enslaved people were invisible when they were working and hypervisible when they weren't. He had been assigned here, perhaps by the overseer Thaddeus Cole, perhaps by fate. He was on his knees in the dirt, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy among the thorns. He wore a straw hat that shadowed his face. Eleanor stopped 10 feet away. Her pulse jumped in her throat. "They're beautiful," she said. Elijah froze. He didn't look up this time. He kept his head bowed, snipping a dead bloom. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was careful, neutral, empty of anything that could be used against him. Eleanor took a step closer. She looked at the scars on his arms, thin white lines that mapped a history of pain. She knew where those scars came from. She knew what Thaddeus Cole's whip looked like. She had heard the screams from the quarters on quiet nights, sounds she had learned to tune out, to pretend were just the wind. Now, looking at the skin that bore the memory of that sound, she couldn't tune it out. "Do you have a family, Elijah?" The question hung in the humid air like a guillotine blade. Enslaved people were not supposed to have families, not in the way white people defined it. They had connections that could be severed at auction, bonds that existed only until they became inconvenient to the master's profit. To ask was to acknowledge his humanity. To answer was to expose his wound. Elijah stopped working. He stayed on his knees, his hands resting on his thighs. He took a long, slow breath. "Had a wife once," he said quietly. He didn't look at her. He spoke to the roses. "Sold off 7 years back to a man in Alabama." Eleanor felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. "And children?" "A daughter," Elijah said. His voice cracked, a microscopic fracture in the stone. "Never knew what happened to her. She was 4. Eleanor's throat tightened. She gripped the lace of her dress until her knuckles turned white. She had heard these stories. Everyone in the South had. They were the background noise of her privilege, the engine that made her silk dresses possible. But hearing it here in the quiet of the morning from a man whose voice rumbled with a grief so profound it seemed to vibrate in the ground, it shattered her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words felt pathetic, obscene in their inadequacy. Elijah turned his head then. He looked up at her from under the brim of his hat. The sun caught his face, illuminating the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the depth of his dark eyes. "Sorrow don't change nothing, ma'am," he said, "but I thank you for it anyway." There was no malice in his voice, just a terrible, crushing truth. She wanted to say more. She wanted to scream. She wanted to fall to her knees in the dirt beside him and beg for forgiveness for her husband, for her father, for herself. But she couldn't. The distance between them was only 3 feet, but it was also a canyon wider than the Mississippi River. "What was her name?" Eleanor asked. "Your wife." Elijah looked at her, searching her face, trying to understand why the governor's wife was asking for the names of ghosts. "Sarah," he said. "Her name was Sarah." "And the girl?" "Grace." "Grace," Eleanor repeated. "That is a beautiful name." "She was a beautiful child," Elijah said softly. They stood there in silence for a long moment, the white woman standing, the black man kneeling, bound together by a conversation that was treasonous in its humanity. Then the sound of boots crunching on gravel broke the spell. Elijah instantly returned to the roses, his posture shifting, his shoulders hunching. He became the gardener again. Eleanor straightened her spine, smoothed her dress, and turned to see the overseer, Thaddeus Cole, walking the perimeter. Cole was a man who enjoyed his work too much. He carried a whip coiled at his belt not just as a tool, but as a limb. He nodded to Eleanor as he passed, touching the brim of his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Beaumont. You're out early." "The heat makes it difficult to sleep, Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was steady, icy. "I was admiring the roses." Cole's eyes flicked to Elijah, then back to Eleanor. His gaze was sharp, calculating. He was a predator, and he knew the scent of disruption. "Make sure he keeps them trimmed back," Cole said, gesturing casually at Elijah with his thumb. "Things grow wild if you don't cut them back hard. That's nature." "I will," Eleanor said. Cole tipped his hat again and walked on, his boots heavy on the path. Eleanor waited until he was out of sight. She looked back at Elijah. He hadn't moved, but she could see the tension in his back, the way he was waiting for the danger to pass. "I have to go," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She left him there, but she came back the next morning, and the morning after that. It became a ritual, a secret religion. Eleanor would rise before the house stirred, slipping out into the gray dawn. She would find him in the garden. At first, they barely spoke. The risk was too high. She would walk, he would work, and the silence between them would be filled with things they couldn't say. But gradually, carefully, the words began to flow. She asked him about the plants. He taught her their names, their needs. He spoke of seasons and pruning, of knowing when to cut back and when to let grow. And in his descriptions of soil and roots, Eleanor heard a philosophy of survival. He spoke of resilience, of how things could live in hostile soil if the roots went deep enough. "You have to know what you are," he told her one morning, holding a clipping of a thorny bush. If you know what you are, the storm can't change you. It can break you, maybe, but it can't change you. She told him about books. She told him about the world beyond Louisiana. Places she had read about but would never see. Paris, Rome, the Alps. She described paintings she had seen in books, reciting poetry she had memorized. He listened, God, how he listened. He drank her words like water. I wish I could read, he admitted one humid Tuesday, to see the words, to know what they look like. I could teach you, Eleanor said. The words were out before she could stop them. Elijah froze. He looked around quickly, scanning the windows of the mansion, the tree line. Teaching a slave to read was illegal. It was a crime that carried severe punishment for him. Whipping, branding, sale to the sugar cane fields where men died in 3 years. For her, it would be scandal and ruin. Don't say that, he hissed. Don't even say that in a joke. I'm not joking, she said. Why shouldn't you know? Why shouldn't you have the words? Because words are dangerous, ma'am. Words make you think you can be something you ain't allowed to be. You are a man, Elijah. You are allowed to be that. He looked at her, and for the first time, Eleanor saw a flicker of anger in his eyes. Am I? He asked. Because the law says I'm a plow. The ledger says I'm $800. Mr. Cole says I'm a mule that talks. You're the only one saying I'm a man and begging your pardon, ma'am, but you don't make the laws. I can't change the laws, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. But I can change this, here, in this garden. She picked up a stick. She smoothed a patch of dirt between the rose bushes. Look, she whispered. She drew a letter in the dirt, a vertical line, 3 horizontal bars. E, she said, for Elijah. He stared at the mark in the dirt. It was a simple shape, but to him it looked like magic. It looked like a key. He hesitated. He looked at the house, looming white and massive against the sky. He looked at the scars on his arms. Then slowly, he reached out with his own rough finger and traced the line in the dirt. E, he whispered. E, she repeated. Their fingers brushed, just for a second, skin against skin, warmth against warmth. Eleanor pulled her hand back as if burned. Elijah jerked away. They stared at each other, eyes wide, breathing hard. The air between them suddenly felt charged, electric, terrifying. In the distance, a rooster crowed. The plantation was waking up. Go, Elijah said, his voice rough. Please go. Eleanor ran back to the house. She didn't look back, but she felt the spot on her finger where he had touched her. It throbbed. It felt more alive than the rest of her body combined. July came and the heat turned biblical. The sun pressed down on the estate like a physical weight. The cotton fields shimmered in the haze. The work was brutal, 18-hour days. The overseers were relentless. Inside the mansion, the air was stagnant. Charles was agitated. Rumors of abolitionist pamphlets circulating in New Orleans had him on edge. He held dinners with other planters, drinking whiskey and discussing the preservation of their way of life. Eleanor sat at these dinners, silent, listening to them speak of human beings as livestock, feeling a nausea that never quite left her. She kept going to the garden. She couldn't stop. It was the only time she felt real. They moved beyond letters in the dirt. They talked about their lives. She told him about her loneliness, the crushing weight of being an ornament. He told her about his childhood before the first sale, the memory of his mother's voice singing. They were falling, they both knew it. It wasn't a soft falling, it was a plummet off a cliff. But they weren't the only ones watching. The house servants knew. They always knew. Enslaved people survived by reading the room, by noticing the subtleties that white people ignored. They saw Eleanor rising early. They saw the flush in her cheeks when she returned. They saw the mud on the hem of her dress. Mama Seraphine, the cook who had been with the Beaumont family for 34 years, watched with eyes that were ancient and sad. She had seen this story before, a generation ago. It ended in blood then. It would end in blood now. One morning, as Eleanor tried to slip out the kitchen door, Seraphine blocked her path. The old woman was small, her hands gnarled from decades of kneading dough and scrubbing floors, but she possessed an authority that made Eleanor stop cold. "Child," Seraphine said. Her voice was low, a rumble. "You playin' with fire that's gonna burn more than just you." Eleanor froze. "I don't know what you mean, Seraphine." "Yes, you do." Seraphine stepped closer. "I seen the way you look when you come back from that garden. I seen the light in your eyes. That ain't the light of the Lord, that's the light of trouble." "We are just talking," Eleanor stammered. "Talkin'?" Seraphine let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "A white woman and a black man don't just talk in this world, Miss Eleanor. Not without somebody dying for it. And it ain't gonna be you swingin' from the rope." The words hit Eleanor like a slap. "He won't." "He will," Seraphine cut her off. "The governor ain't a fool, he's a predator. He smells change in the wind. You think you hidden. You think 'cause you whisperin' among the roses that nobody sees. The walls got eyes, child. The trees got ears." "I'll be careful," Eleanor pleaded. "Careful ain't enough," Seraphine said. She grabbed Eleanor's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "You need to stop, right now, today, before you get that boy killed. You hear me? Dead." Eleanor pulled her arm away. She knew the old woman was right. She knew every step she took toward Elijah was a step toward his grave. But the thought of stopping, the thought of going back to the silence, to the hollowness, to the life of a ghost, it was unbearable. "I can't," Eleanor whispered. "Then God have mercy on you," Seraphine said, turning back to her stove. "'Cause men won't." Eleanor went to the garden anyway, but Elijah wasn't there. Panic flared in her chest. Had they taken him? Had Charles found out? She walked to the edge of the grounds, risking visibility. She scanned the fields. Then she saw him. He had been moved. He was no longer in the garden. He was in the far workshed near the stables, repairing a wagon wheel. It was a demotion, or a precaution. Thaddeus Cole was separating them. Eleanor should have taken the warning. She should have turned back. Instead, she crossed the open ground, moving quickly, her heart hammering. She ducked into the workshed. The space was dim, smelling of wood shavings and grease. Elijah looked up, startled. When he saw her, his face didn't light up, it crumpled with fear. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, standing up. "Cole is watching. He's been asking questions, where I go, who I talk to." "I know," Eleanor said, breathless. "Seraphine told me." "Then why you here?" Elijah's voice rose, desperate. "You want me to die, is that it?" "No, I couldn't." "Couldn't what?" "Couldn't stay in your big house. Couldn't live without your little adventure." He was angry now, truly angry, the fear turning into rage. "This ain't a game, Eleanor. This ain't a story in one of your books. If they catch us, you get sent to your sister for a vacation. Me? They tie me to a tree and they strip the skin off my back until I can't breathe, or they hang me, or they burn me." He stepped closer, looming over her, trying to scare her away. "Look at me," he demanded. "I am property, I am a thing to them, and to you, am I just something exciting, something to make you feel alive because you bored?" Eleanor slapped him. The sound cracked through the shed like a gunshot. Silent, absolute, terrified silence. Elijah stood there, his cheeks stinging, staring at her. Eleanor stared back, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare say that. You are the only thing that is real. You are the only person who has ever seen me. I am not bored, Elijah. I am in love with you." The words hung in the air, the most dangerous sentence ever spoken on the Beaumont estate. Elijah's anger drained away, replaced by a look of sheer devastation. "Don't say that," he whispered. "Please don't say that." "I love you," she repeated. "I love your mind, I love your hands, I love the way you refuse to be broken, I love you." Elijah closed his eyes. He looked like a man in physical pain. He looked like a man fighting a war inside his own skull. "You can't," he said. "It's a death sentence." "Then let it be," she said. She stepped closer. She reached out and took his hand. his rough, calloused, scarred hand. She pressed it to her cheek. "I would rather die feeling this," she said, "than live another 100 years feeling nothing." Elijah let out a shuddering breath. He opened his eyes. He looked at her and the walls he had built for 30 years, the walls that kept him safe, that kept him sane, crumbled. He turned his hand and cupped her face. His thumb brushed away a tear. "Eleanor," he whispered. And in the shadows of the workshed, surrounded by the tools of his enslavement, he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It was terrified. It was the collision of two starving people finding bread. It tasted of salt and fear and doom. For a minute the world didn't exist. There was no governor, no overseer, no slavery, no law, just a man and a woman in the dark. Then a shadow fell across the doorway. They broke apart, hearts hammering against their ribs like frantic drums. It wasn't coal, it was just a cloud passing over the sun, but the spell was broken. The reality of their position crashed back down on them. "You have to go," Elijah said, his voice shaking. "Now." "I'll find a way," Eleanor said. "We can't speak like this, it's too dangerous, but I'll find a way." "How?" "Letters," she said. "I'll write to you. I'll find someone to carry them." Eleanor, "No, writing it down. That's evidence." "It's the only way," she said. "I won't let you go, I won't." She turned and ran back toward the house, leaving Elijah standing in the dark, his hand still burning where he had touched her face. He knew with the heavy, sinking certainty of a man who understood the South that he had just signed his own death warrant. He knew he should run. He should leave tonight, but he also knew he wouldn't, because for the first time in his life he wasn't just surviving, he was living, and God help him, he wanted to see what happened next. But in the shadows of the main house, behind the velvet curtains of the parlor, eyes were watching. Charles Beaumont stood at the window, a cigar burning in his hand. He watched his wife run from the workshed. He watched her flushed face. He watched the way she touched her own cheek. And in the South, being watched was the first step toward being buried. August turned the heat into a weapon. The air grew so heavy it felt like breathing underwater. The Mississippi River was low and sluggish, and the cotton bolls burst open, painting the fields in a blinding, mocking white. And in the shadows of this sweltering hell, the letters began. They were paper ghosts passing between two worlds that were never meant to touch. Eleanor couldn't just hand a note to Elijah. That was suicide. She needed a bridge. She found it in Dinah. Dinah was 16 years old, a housemaid with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that stayed shut. She was small, quick, and possessed the specific, terrifying intelligence of a girl who knows she is prey in a house of wolves. Eleanor cornered her one evening in the linen closet, the smell of lavender and starch thick in the air. "Dinah," Eleanor whispered, her hands trembling as she held out a folded square of parchment sealed with red wax. "I need you to do something dangerous." Dinah looked at the letter, then at Eleanor. She didn't ask what it was. She knew. She had seen the way Eleanor looked at the window when the sun went down. She had seen the mud on her hem. "If Master Charles catch me with that," Dinah said softly, "he'll skin me." "He won't catch you," Eleanor pleaded. "You are invisible to him. He looks right through you. Please, Dinah, I have no one else." The girl hesitated. She looked at the white woman begging her for help, and maybe she saw the desperation, or maybe she just understood that in this house, women had to help women because the men certainly wouldn't. She took the letter. She tucked it into the bodice of her dress, right against her skin. "If I die for this," Dinah said, "you remember my name." "I promise," Eleanor said. That night Dinah slipped out to the quarters. She moved like a shadow, avoiding the overseer's patrols. She found Elijah sitting by the door of his cabin, staring at the moon, rubbing a shoulder that ached from 12 hours of hoeing. She pressed the paper into his hand and vanished before he could say a word. Elijah waited until the other men were asleep. He lit a candle stub, shielding the flame with his body, and broke the seal. He stared at the words. He couldn't read well. He had picked up scraps here and there from discarded newspapers, but Eleanor's handwriting was clear and the words burned. Elijah, I was dead before I met you. I moved through this house like a ghost, but you looked at me and I woke up. I know the danger. I know the madness. But if being alive means feeling this fear, then I choose the fear. Write to me. Tell me I am not alone in this. He read it 3 times. Then, with a pencil stub he kept hidden under a loose floorboard, he wrote back. His handwriting was cramped, the spelling phonetic and rough, a crime in itself. Eleanor, I've been dead since I was 8. Dead since they sold my wife. Dead since I couldn't save my girl, but you make me remember I got a heart, and a heart can break. That scares me more than the whip, but yes, you matter more than breath. For 6 weeks the letters flowed. Dinah carried them in laundry baskets, in aprons, in shoes. They wrote about everything. Eleanor wrote about the suffocating silence of her marriage. Elijah wrote about the fields, about the specific agony of being a man who is treated like a mule. They built a world on paper, a world where they were just a man and a woman, stripped of titles and chains. It was intimate, it was beautiful, and it was incredibly reckless. They got comfortable. That is the tragedy of it. They began to believe that because they hadn't been caught yet, they wouldn't be caught. They mistook luck for safety. But luck runs out, especially in Louisiana, especially for people like them. It happened in late September. The harvest was beginning. The house was busy. Eleanor was out calling on a neighbor, a social obligation she couldn't avoid. Charles was home. He wasn't looking for betrayal. He was looking for a deed to a parcel of land he intended to buy. He went into Eleanor's private sitting room, a place he rarely entered. He opened her writing desk. He rummaged through the drawers. And there, tucked beneath a stack of French poetry books, he felt the crinkle of paper. He pulled them out, a bundle of 8 letters tied with a blue ribbon. Charles Beaumont stood in the center of the room, the silence pressing in on him. He unfolded the top letter. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was his wife. But the other handwriting, the rough, jagged scrawl of the responses, that was alien. He read. He didn't scream. He didn't tear the room apart. Charles was a creature of control. As he read the words of love, of longing, of a shared humanity that defied the very laws of nature as he understood them, his face didn't flush with rage. It drained of blood. It became a mask of absolute frozen fury. This wasn't just infidelity. Infidelity he could have handled. Men had affairs. Women had dalliances. It was a scandal, but it was manageable. This was treason. This was a violation of the natural order. His wife, the symbol of white Southern purity, was pouring her soul out to a piece of property. She wasn't just sleeping with him, she was talking to him. She was treating him like an equal, like a man. That was the unforgivable sin. Charles folded the letters carefully. He put them in the inside pocket of his frock coat. He didn't burn them. He needed them. They were his weapon. He walked out of the room, closed the door gently, and went downstairs to his study. He poured a glass of brandy. He lit a cigar, and he waited. He waited for 3 hours. He watched the sun go down. He watched the shadows stretch across the lawn. He watched Eleanor's carriage return. Eleanor knew the moment she walked into the house. There is a specific vibration to a home when a catastrophe is waiting to happen. The servants were too quiet. They wouldn't meet her eyes. Dinah was nowhere to be found. Eleanor walked up the stairs, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She went to her room. She went straight to the desk. She opened the drawer. Empty. The world dropped out from under her. The floor seemed to tilt. She gasped, a sound that was half sob, half scream. He knows. She didn't think about her reputation. She didn't think about her marriage. She thought of one thing only, Elijah. Dinah, she screamed, running into the hallway. Dinah. The girl appeared from the shadows of the linen closet, her face gray with terror. He found them, Eleanor choked out, grabbing Dinah's shoulders. Where is Charles? Where is Elijah? The governor is in his study, Dinah whispered, tears spilling over. But Mr. Cole. I saw Mr. Cole and 3 men head to the quarters 10 minutes ago. They had rope, Miss Eleanor. They had rope and guns. No, Eleanor whispered. Oh God, no. She didn't think. She didn't pause to consider the insanity of what she was about to do. She turned and ran. She ran down the grand staircase, her silk skirts tangling around her legs. She ran through the foyer, past the portraits of Charles's ancestors who stared down in judgment. She burst out the front door and sprinted across the lawn. The sun had set, and the purple twilight was deepening into black. Torches were already lit in the slave quarters, flickering like angry eyes in the distance. She could hear shouting. Eleanor ran harder, her lungs burned. Her hair came loose from its pins, cascading down her back in a wild, golden tangle. She was a woman unraveling. She reached the edge of the quarters just as they dragged him out. Thaddeus Cole had Elijah. 2 other men, hired hands, were holding him. Elijah's hands were tied behind his back. His lip was split, blood running down his chin in a dark stream. He wasn't fighting. He knew that fighting meant immediate death. He stood tall, his eyes scanning the darkness, accepting his fate with a terrifying dignity. Stop, Eleanor screamed. The sound tore through the humid air. The men froze. The enslaved families, who had been watching from their doorways in terrified silence, gasped. Eleanor Beaumont, the governor's wife, stumbled into the circle of torchlight. She was panting, her chest heaving, her dress torn at the hem. Let him go, she commanded. Her voice shook, but it was loud. I said let him go. Cole looked at her. He smiled, a slow, cruel curving of his lips. He didn't look respectful anymore. He looked at her like she was something dirty. Go back to the house, Mrs. Beaumont, Cole said, spitting on the ground. This ain't no place for a lady, especially not now. I am your mistress, and I am ordering you to release him. You have no authority here, Eleanor. The voice came from behind her. It was dry, calm, and terrifying. Eleanor turned. Charles was walking toward them from the main house. He moved slowly, leaning on his cane, though he didn't need it. He looked immaculate in his evening suit. He stopped 5 feet from her. Charles, she gasped. Charles, please don't do this. Do what? Charles asked. He looked at Elijah, then at Eleanor. Dispose of a rabid dog, secure my property, or punish a traitor. He hasn't done anything, Eleanor cried. She stepped between Charles and Elijah, shielding the man she loved with her own body. The visual was shocking, the white woman protecting the black man. It sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. He hasn't done anything. Charles reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out the bundle of letters. He held them up in the torchlight. You matter more than breath, Charles read aloud. His voice dripped with mockery. I wake up remembering I have a heart. Poetic, truly. He tossed the letters onto the dusty ground. You wrote love letters to a slave, Eleanor. You debased yourself. You debased me. You debased your race. I loved him, Eleanor shouted. The confession hung in the air, absolute and undeniable. I love him, and he is a better man than you will ever be. He is kind. He is real. You are nothing but a suit of clothes filled with hate. The slap was so fast no one saw it coming. Crack! It knocked Eleanor off her feet. She hit the ground hard, tasting copper. The world spun. Don't you touch her. The roar came from Elijah. The restraint broke. He lunged. He threw himself forward, slamming his shoulder into one of the guards, knocking the man back. He wasn't thinking about survival anymore. He was seeing the woman he loved bleeding in the dirt. Get off me, Elijah bellowed, struggling against the ropes. Cole stepped forward and brought the butt of his pistol down on Elijah's head. Thud. Elijah crumbled to his knees, dazed, blood pouring from his hairline. See, Charles said softly, looking down at his wife. See the savage. You think you love him, Eleanor, but he is an animal, and animals must be put down when they bite. Eleanor pushed herself up. Her lip was swelling. She looked at her husband with a hatred so pure it felt like clarity. "If you kill him," she hissed, "I will scream the truth from the rooftops. I will tell everyone in Baton Rouge. I will tell the newspapers. I will ruin you, Charles. I swear to God, I will burn your reputation to ash." Charles studied her. He saw that she meant it. He saw that she was past the point of shame. A dead martyr was dangerous. A living scandal was worse. He needed a solution that erased the problem without creating a legend. "Kill him?" Charles chuckled. "Oh no, my dear, I'm not going to kill him. That would be too quick, too merciful." He turned to Cole. "Is the transport arranged?" "Yes, sir," Cole said, grinning. "Boat leaves at dawn." "Good." Charles looked at Elijah, who was struggling to stay conscious. "I am selling you, Elijah, to the Hendricks plantation in Mississippi." A collective gasp went through the quarters. Even the children knew the name Hendricks. It wasn't a farm, it was a graveyard. It was a place where they sent the rebellious, the strong, the problems. They worked you until your heart burst. Life expectancy upon arrival was 3 years, usually less. "No," Eleanor whispered. "Charles, please kill him, just kill him, don't send him there." "It is done," Charles said. "He will rot in the cane fields. He will die slowly, day by day, knowing that it was your love that sent him there." Charles turned his cold eyes back to Eleanor. "And you are going to Charleston, to your sister. You will stay there for 6 months. We will tell the world you have had a nervous collapse, a hysteria. When you return, you will be silent. You will be obedient, or I will have you committed to an asylum for the insane. Do you understand?" Eleanor looked at Elijah. He was on his knees, blood in his eyes, looking back at her. "I'm sorry," she mouthed. "I'm so sorry." Elijah shook his head slightly. Even now, facing hell, he was trying to comfort her. "Take him," Charles ordered. Cole and the men grabbed Elijah and dragged him toward the holding cell, a small brick structure used for runaways. They threw him inside. Eleanor heard the heavy iron bolt slide home, the sound of a tomb sealing. "Take Mrs. Beaumont to her room," Charles said to the servants who had gathered. "Lock the door. Nail the windows shut if you have to. If she escapes, I will flay every one of you." They dragged Eleanor back to the house. She didn't fight. Her spirit had been snapped. She went limp, letting them carry her like a broken doll. She sat in the dark of her room, listening to the crickets, listening to the silence of the house. She had destroyed him. She had reached for happiness and caught death instead. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The plantation slept an uneasy, terrified sleep. But not everyone was sleeping. Down in the quarters, shadows were moving. It wasn't a rebellion, it was a rescue. Suddenly, a shout cut through the night, then another. "Fire, fire in the quarters." Eleanor rushed to her window. She pressed her face against the glass. Down near the overseer's house, flames were licking up into the sky. The storage shed next to the holding cell was ablaze. It was burning hot and fast, the dry timber catching like kindling. Chaos erupted below. Men were running with buckets. Cole was shouting orders. Eleanor watched, her heart in her throat. The fire was a distraction. It had to be. And then she saw it. Through the smoke and the confusion, a figure sprinted from the back of the smokehouse. He was running low, moving toward the swamp, toward the tree line where the cypress trees stood like sentinels. He was fast, he was desperate. It was Elijah. Someone, maybe Dinah, maybe one of the field hands who remembered a kindness Elijah had shown them, had picked the lock while the shed burned. "Run," Eleanor whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Run, you beautiful fool, run." A gunshot cracked through the air. Cole had seen him. Eleanor screamed. But Elijah didn't fall. He didn't slow down. He hit the water of the swamp, splashing through the muck, and disappeared into the blackness of the bayou. The dogs were barking now. The hounds were baying, catching the scent. Men were mounting horses. The hunt was on. Charles burst out onto the veranda below, shouting orders. Find him, dead or alive. I want him back." Eleanor slid down to the floor, her back against the wall beneath the window. She hugged her knees to her chest. He was gone. He was running into a swamp full of gators and snakes, chased by men with guns and dogs. His chances of survival were almost zero. But almost zero wasn't zero. He was free. For this minute, for this hour, he was free. The next morning, Eleanor was put into a carriage. The windows were curtained. Charles didn't come to say goodbye. She was driven away from the only home she had known for 15 years, heading for Charleston, heading for exile. She didn't look back at the mansion. She looked at the tree line. She looked at the North Star, invisible in the daylight but burning somewhere in the blue sky. "Run, Elijah." She thought, just keep running. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. She didn't know if he would live through the night. But as the carriage rattled down the long dirt road, leaving the Beaumont estate behind, Eleanor made a vow. She would survive this. She would wait, and if he lived, she would find him. But the South does not let go of its prisoners easily, and the story of Eleanor and Elijah was far from over. In fact, the real darkness was just beginning. The swamp does not care if you are innocent. It does not care if you are in love or if you are fleeing for your life. To the bayou, a man is just meat. Elijah ran until his lungs bled. He ran until the sound of the hounds faded into the dull roar of his own pulse. He plunged into water black as ink, hiding under the root systems of cypress trees while men with torches passed 10 feet away. He held his breath until his vision spotted, listening to them curse the mud, curse the night, curse him. For 3 weeks he was an animal. He ate roots and raw fish. He slept in trees to avoid the gators. He moved only by starlight, following the moss on the north side of the trunks, navigating a green hell designed to kill anything that tried to cross it. But Elijah had something the men hunting him didn't have. He had a memory. He had the ghost of Eleanor's touch on his face. He had the echo of her voice saying, "You are a man." And that memory was a shield that the swamp couldn't break. He didn't just survive, he endured. He crossed the border into Mississippi, then Tennessee, moving through a shadow network of barns and basements, the Underground Railroad. It wasn't a railroad, of course. It was a whisper, a handshake in the dark, a candle in a window. It was 1,000 small acts of courage by people who refused to let the darkness win. Back in Charleston, Eleanor Beaumont was enduring a different kind of hell. They called it a rest cure. It was a prison with velvet curtains. She sat in her sister's parlor drinking tea that tasted like ash, listening to women gossip about fashion and the price of silk while her soul screamed. She was watched constantly. Her letters were read. Her walks were chaperoned. She was being rehabilitated, reprogrammed to be the governor's wife again. She learned the art of the mask. She learned to smile without moving her eyes. She learned to say, "Yes, I am feeling much better," while imagining the mansion burning to the ground. 6 months later, in the spring of 1848, she returned to St. Helena. She came back thinner, harder. The softness that Elijah had loved was gone, replaced by something brittle and sharp. Charles met her at the door. He didn't kiss her. He inspected her, like a repairman checking to see if a broken clock had been fixed. "Welcome home, Eleanor," he said. "I trust you are recovered." "Completely, Charles," she said. Her voice was flat, dead. "Good, we have a dinner with the senator next week. Wear the blue silk." "Yes, Charles." They resumed their lives, but it was a pantomime. Eleanor walked the halls like a ghost. She slept in her cold bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering if Elijah was dead, wondering if his bones were sinking into the mud of the Atchafalaya. Years passed, 1849, 1850. The world outside was changing. The country was tearing itself apart. The compromise of 1850 tried to glue the cracks together, but you can't fix a house built on a foundation of bones. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that even if Elijah had made it north, he wasn't safe. Bounty hunters could drag him back from the free states. The thought haunted Eleanor. Inside the Beaumont estate, the rot was deepening. Charles grew paranoid. He doubled the patrols. Thaddeus Cole became a tyrant, his cruelty expanding unchecked. The whipping post was used so often the ground beneath it was permanently stained dark. Eleanor watched it all, but she didn't turn away anymore. Before, she had been blind to the machinery of the plantation. Now she stared right at it. She realized that her grief was useless. Her love was a memory, but her anger was a weapon. In the winter of 1852, Eleanor made a decision. If she couldn't save them, she would witness them. She found an old ledger in the library, a leather-bound book intended for accounting. She took it to her room. She locked the door, and she began to write. She didn't write poetry, she wrote testimony. She wrote down the names, not breeding stock or field hands, but names: Sarah, Isaac, Ruth, Thomas. She wrote down their ages. She wrote down who they loved and who they had lost. She recorded the crimes. She documented every beating she witnessed from her window. She wrote down the dates of the sales, the families separated on the auction block. She wrote down Charles's political dealings, the bribes he took, the corrupt laws he helped pass to keep the system grinding forward. It was dangerous work. If Charles found this book, he wouldn't just send her away. He would have her committed to an asylum for the criminally insane. He would destroy her mind. But the writing kept her sane. It was an act of defiance. Every drop of ink was a rebellion. She wasn't alone. Dinah was still there. The girl had grown into a woman. At 20, Dinah was the housekeeper, sharp-eyed and silent. She became Eleanor's eyes and ears. She brought Eleanor stories from the quarters: who was sick, who was missing, who had been sold. Eleanor wrote it all down. "You building a coffin with that book," Dinah whispered one night, watching Eleanor scribble by candlelight. "Maybe," Eleanor said, "but at least I'll leave a map of where the bodies are buried." "You think words gonna change him?" "No, words won't change him, but they might hang him." Then came the spring of 1853. The peddler arrived in a rattletrap wagon, selling pots, pans, and ribbons. He was a free black man from Pennsylvania, a rare sight in the Deep South. He stopped at the kitchen door. Dinah went out to inspect his wares. They haggled over a spool of thread. It was a performance. And in the middle of the performance, as Dinah handed him a coin, he pressed something into her palm. A letter. It wasn't sealed with wax. It was dirty, folded a dozen times, smelling of travel and sweat. Dinah brought it to Eleanor's room. She locked the door behind her. Her hands were shaking. "It's from him," Dinah whispered. Eleanor stopped breathing. She stared at the paper in Dinah's hand. For 5 years she had assumed he was dead. For 5 years she had mourned him. She took the letter. Her fingers couldn't find the edge to open it. She finally tore it, almost ripping the paper in her haste. The handwriting was different, stronger, confident. The handwriting of a man who could write without fear of the whip. "Eleanor, I am alive. I made it. I'm in Canada. I am free." Eleanor dropped to her knees. A sound came out of her, a guttural animal sob that she buried in her skirts. "I have a room of my own. I work as a carpenter. I walk down the street and no man owns me, but I am not whole, because I left my heart in a garden in Louisiana. I know you cannot read this. I know you are lost to me, but I had to tell you. We were right. We were right to want this. I look at the North Star every night and I thank God for you." He was alive. He was free. Eleanor sat on the floor, clutching the letter to her chest, rocking back and forth. The tears that fell were hot, cleansing. But as the joy washed over her, something else followed, a cold, hard clarity. She looked around her room, the silk curtains, the mahogany furniture, the cage. "I can't stay here," she said. The voice didn't sound like hers. It sounded like the woman she was supposed to be. Dinah looked down at her. "Ma'am." "I can't stay here, Dinah, knowing he is alive, knowing there is a place where we could be. I can't stay in this house and pretend anymore. I can't live with a monster. You leave, Dinah said slowly, and Charles will hunt you down. You ain't safe just 'cause you white. You his property, too. I know, Eleanor stood up. She wiped her face. That is why we aren't just going to run. We are going to vanish. She looked at Dinah. Come with me. Dinah blinked. What? Come with me, north to Canada. Miss Eleanor, you crazy. 2 women, one of 'em black, traveling 1,000 miles. You have connections, Dinah. I know you do. The peddler, the network, you know the roots. I might know people who know people, Dinah admitted cautiously. And I have money, Eleanor said. I have jewelry, diamonds, rubies, gold. I will strip this house of everything valuable that I can carry. We will buy our passage. Dinah stared at her. She saw the shift. This wasn't the romantic, weeping woman of 5 years ago. This was a strategist. You really mean it, Dinah said. You willing to burn your life down? My life is already ash, Eleanor said. I want to rise from it. Dinah smiled. It was a small, sharp smile. Took you long enough. The planning began. It was a high-wire act performed over a pit of vipers. For 3 months, Eleanor slowly liquidated her assets. She claimed a diamond brooch was lost. In reality, she had given it to the peddler to secure false papers. She began sewing gold coins into the hems of her petticoats. She prepared the ledger of sins, wrapping it in oilcloth to protect it from the elements. She was going to take the evidence with her. She wrote back to Elijah, just 3 words. I am coming. August 1853. The air was thick with humidity and tension. Charles was suspicious. He felt the change in the house. He watched Eleanor with narrow, reptilian eyes. She was too calm, too obedient. He checked the accounts. He noticed small discrepancies. He questioned the servants. He was circling. Eleanor and Dinah set the date, October 15th, the night of the governor's ball in Baton Rouge. Charles would be away for 2 days. It was their only window. But Charles Beaumont was not a man who allowed himself to be deceived twice. 2 weeks before the ball, on a rainy Tuesday in September, Eleanor came back to her room to find the door unlocked. She froze. She always locked it. She pushed the door open. Charles was sitting at her writing desk. The oilcloth package was open. The ledger of sins was in his hands. He was reading. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the rain drumming against the glass. Charles turned the page. He didn't look up. October 12, 1851, he read aloud. His voice was terrifyingly conversational. Governor Beaumont accepted a bribe of $5,000 from the Railroad Consortium to divert the tracks through the St. Helena Parish cemeteries. He turned another page. November 3, 1852. Thaddeus Cole whipped the boy Thomas until he lost consciousness. The governor watched from the veranda, smoking a cigar. He finally looked up. His face wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was disappointed. It was the face of a man who realizes he has to put down a beloved pet because it has turned rabid. I thought you were cured, Eleanor, he said softly. I thought we had fixed you. Eleanor stood in the doorway. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She felt a strange, cold peace. The lying was over. You can't fix someone who sees you for what you are, Charles, she said. Charles closed the book. He ran his hand over the leather cover, almost affectionately. This, he said, tapping the ledger, is dangerous. This is powerful. If this got out, my enemies would feast. That is the point, Eleanor said. And you were going to take it to the North, to the abolitionists. Yes. And you were going to meet him, weren't you? The savage, the carpenter. Eleanor lifted her chin. His name is Elijah, and yes, I am going to him. Charles stood up. He picked up the ledger. He walked over to the fireplace, where a small fire was burning to chase away the damp chill. No, Eleanor gasped, stepping forward. Charles threw the book into the fire. "No," Eleanor screamed. She lunged, reaching into the flames, her hand grazing the hot grate. Charles grabbed her wrist. He twisted it hard, forcing her back. They watched the book burn. The pages curled, blackening, the ink bubbled. The names Sarah, Isaac, Ruth, Thomas turned to smoke and vanished up the chimney. 5 years of testimony, 5 years of truth, gone in seconds. "There," Charles said, releasing her. "Now it never happened." Eleanor stared at the fire. Tears hot and angry pricked her eyes. "Burning it doesn't make it untrue, Charles. It just makes you a coward." Charles looked at her with pity. "You really don't understand, do you, my dear? Truth is what I say it is. History is what I decide to write. And you." He walked to the door. He turned the key in the lock, testing it. "You are not going to the ball, Eleanor. You are not going to the north. You are not going anywhere." "You can't keep me here forever," she spat. "Forever?" Charles smiled. "No, not forever. Just until I figure out how to explain your tragic, accidental death." He stepped out into the hall. "Charles," she screamed, rushing the door. He slammed it. She heard the key turn, click. "Guards!" Charles shouted in the hallway. "Mrs. Beaumont is unwell. No one enters this room. No one speaks to her. If she tries to pass a message, you bring it to me. If she tries to leave, you restrain her." Eleanor pounded on the wood. "Charles, you can't do this." "It's already done." His voice came through the thick oak, muffled and final. "Goodbye, Eleanor." She heard his footsteps walking away. She slumped against the door, sliding down until she hit the floor. The fire crackled in the grate, consuming the last of the ledger. She was trapped. The evidence was gone. The escape plan was shattered. But as she sat there in the dark, listening to the rain, Eleanor realized something. He had burned the book. He had locked the door. He thought he had won. But he had forgotten one thing. He had forgotten Dinah. And he had forgotten that a woman who has lost everything has absolutely nothing left to fear. Charles Beaumont wanted a tragedy. Fine, she would give him one. The 15th of October, 1853, arrived not with a bang, but with a terrifying stillness. The governor's ball was scheduled for that evening in Baton Rouge. Charles had made a great show of his departure. The carriage had been prepared, his trunks loaded. He had stood in the foyer, speaking loudly to the staff, ensuring everyone knew the governor would be gone for 2 days. He gave specific instructions. Mrs. Beaumont was unwell. She was sedated. Under no circumstances was she to be disturbed until he returned. He walked out the front door, climbed into his carriage, and the horses trotted down the long oak-lined drive. But he didn't go to Baton Rouge. A mile down the road, Charles ordered the driver to stop. He sent the man ahead with the carriage to maintain the illusion, and then, under the cover of a moonless night, the governor of St. Helena walked back to his own estate. He moved through the shadows of the cypress trees, a silhouette of malice returning to the house he had built to burn it down. Inside her room, Eleanor was awake. She hadn't slept in 2 days. The door was still locked. The windows, she had discovered, had been nailed shut from the outside. She was sealed in a box. She didn't know how he would do it. She only knew he would. Charles was a man of efficiency. He wouldn't use poison, too traceable. He wouldn't use a knife, too messy. She sat in the chair by the cold fireplace, dressed in her travel clothes, the one she had prepared for the escape that would never happen. She held a heavy brass candlestick in her lap. It was a pathetic weapon against a man who owned the law, but it was all she had. Midnight struck. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 12 times. The sound reverberated through the floorboards like a funeral bell. Then came the smell. It started faint, a whisper of pine and oil, then it grew stronger, acrid, choking. It wasn't the smell of a hearth fire, it was the smell of destruction. Eleanor rushed to the door. She pressed her face against the wood. Heat was radiating through the oak. "Help," she screamed, pounding on the panels. "Fire, someone help me." Her voice echoed in the hallway, but no footsteps came. Charles had cleared the wing. He had sent the servants to the quarters or the far kitchens. He had ensured she would die alone, screaming in the dark, a tragic accident for the papers to mourn. Smoke began to curl under the door, snake-like and gray. It filled the room instantly, stinging her eyes, coating her throat with soot. Eleanor ran to the window. She smashed the glass with the candlestick crash, but the heavy wooden shutters outside were nailed tight. She battered against them, screaming until her voice tore, but they didn't budge. She was going to burn alive. She retreated to the center of the room, coughing, her eyes watering. The heat was rising. She could hear the roar now, a terrifying, low-frequency rumble like a train approaching. The east wing was being consumed. She dropped to her knees. She didn't pray to God. She prayed to Elijah. "I'm sorry," she thought. "I tried. I really tried." She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the flames to burst through the door. Boom! The door didn't burn down. It exploded inward. Splinters of wood flew across the room. Through the swirling gray smoke, a figure emerged. It wasn't Charles. It wasn't a demon. It was Dinah. She held a heavy iron fire axe in her hands, her chest heaving, her face streaked with soot and sweat. Behind her stood Mama Seraphine and two other field hands, their faces wrapped in wet rags. "Get up," Dinah shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire. "We movin' now." Eleanor scrambled to her feet, coughing. The door, it was locked. "That ain't nothing a axe can't fix," Dinah spat. She grabbed Eleanor's arm with a grip like steel. "Come on, the roof gonna go any second." They ran into the hallway. It was a tunnel of hell. The wallpaper was peeling and curling from the heat. The air was thick with black smoke that tasted of varnish and death. Flames were licking up the staircase, climbing the banisters like vines of light. "Keep low," Seraphine yelled, her voice surprisingly powerful. They scrambled down the back stairs, the service entrance. The heat was physical, a wall pushing them back, but they fought through it. They burst out of the kitchen door and tumbled onto the cool, wet grass of the lawn. Eleanor collapsed, gasping for air, retching as the clean oxygen hit her smoke-filled lungs. Dinah fell beside her, dropping the axe. "We out," Dinah wheezed. "We out, Miss Eleanor, you alive." Eleanor looked up. The mansion was screaming. The entire east wing was a tower of orange flame. The fire was moving fast, eating its way toward the center of the house, toward the grand foyer and the library. It was terrifying and beautiful, a judgment written in fire. Dozens of enslaved people were gathering on the lawn, watching the symbol of their oppression burn. Some held buckets, making a half-hearted attempt to douse the flames, but most just watched. There was a grim satisfaction in their silence. Eleanor scanned the crowd. She looked for the carriage. She looked for the overseer. "Where is he?" she rasped, grabbing Dinah's arm. "Where is Charles?" "Gone," Dinah said. "Supposed to be in Baton Rouge, remember?" "No," Eleanor shook her head, panic rising again. "He came back. He set the fire. I smelled the oil. He has to be here." She scanned the faces of the men and women on the lawn. No Charles. No Thaddeus Cole. "If he said it," Seraphine said, stepping forward, her face grim, "then he watched it. He wanted to make sure you was dead." Eleanor looked back at the burning house. Her eyes locked on the library window on the ground floor. The curtains were burning, but through the glass she saw movement, a shadow, a figure struggling. "He's inside," Eleanor whispered. "Good," Dinah said. Her voice was cold as the grave. "Let him burn." Eleanor looked at Dinah. She saw the hate in the young woman's eyes, a hate that had been earned, drop by drop, beating by beating, year by year. It was a righteous hate. Charles deserved to die. He was a monster who had tried to murder his wife, who had enslaved hundreds, who had destroyed lives for profit. The moral choice was simple: walk away, let the fire have him. But Eleanor Beaumont found she couldn't move. It wasn't love. Love had died the day he slapped her in the quarters. It wasn't duty. It wasn't forgiveness. It was defiance. If she let him burn, she became like him. She became a creature who solved problems with death. She became a part of the cycle of violence he had built. "I have to get him," Eleanor said. Dinah grabbed her skirt. "You crazy, look at it, the whole house calming down." "I am not him," Eleanor shouted, pulling away. "I am not him." She turned and ran. "Miss Eleanor," Dinah screamed. Eleanor didn't stop. She pulled her shawl up over her nose and mouth and plunged back into the inferno. The heat hit her like a hammer. Her eyebrows singed instantly. The roar was deafening. She ran through the kitchen, dodging falling debris. The main hallway was a furnace. The crystal chandelier, the pride of the Beaumont estate, had crashed to the floor, a tangled mess of wire and glass. "Charles," she screamed. Her voice was swallowed by the fire. She reached the library doors. They were hot to the touch. She kicked them open. The room was filled with smoke, illuminated by the flames eating the bookshelves. The history of the world, the law books, the ledgers, all turning to ash. And there, in the center of the room, was the governor. He wasn't standing. A massive oak beam from the ceiling had collapsed, pinning him to the floor. It lay across his legs, crushing them. He was conscious. His face was gray, streaked with soot and blood. He was clawing at the rug, trying to drag himself free, but he was trapped. When he saw Eleanor emerge from the smoke, he stopped struggling. He blinked, as if seeing a ghost. "You," he wheezed. A cough rattled his chest, spraying blood on his white shirt. "You got out." "I did," Eleanor said, moving toward him. The heat in the room was unbearable. Books were exploding on the shelves. "You came back," Charles said. He sounded genuinely confused. "Why? I tried to kill you." "I know," Eleanor said. She reached the beam. She grabbed it with both hands. "Push, Charles, push." She heaved. She put every ounce of her strength, every year of repressed rage, into lifting that wood. It didn't move. It was solid oak, supporting the weight of the floor above. It weighed hundreds of pounds. "It's no use," Charles gasped. He winced, pain flashing across his limestone face. "My legs, they're shattered." Eleanor kept pulling. Her hands blistered on the hot wood. "I am not leaving you here." "Why?" Charles yelled, his voice cracking. "I burned your book. I sold your lover. I locked you in a room to die. Why are you doing this?" Eleanor let go of the beam. She fell to her knees, coughing, staring into his eyes. "Because I am alive," she said. "And you are dead. You've been dead for years, Charles. You died the moment you decided power was more important than people. But I am alive, and living people don't leave others to burn." Charles stared at her. For the first time in 15 years, the mask slipped completely. The governor vanished. The tyrant vanished. All that was left was a small, frightened, broken man dying in the ruin of his own ambition. Charles started, his eyes watered. "I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of everything," he whispered. "Of losing control, of you, of him, of the world changing." Above them the ceiling groaned. A shower of sparks rained down. "Go," Charles said. His voice was firm now. "Eleanor, go." "I can't." "You can't save me," Charles said. He reached out a trembling hand. He didn't touch her. He just held it there in the space between them. "The beam crushed me. Even if you lift it, I'm done. Don't die with me. You won. You win." Eleanor looked at him. She saw the truth in his eyes. He was already gone. "I didn't want to win," she whispered. "I just wanted to live." "Then go live," Charles said. He closed his eyes. "Go find him." The roof gave a terrifying crack. Eleanor scrambled back. A massive section of plaster crashed down right where she had been standing. She took one last look at her husband. He was murmuring something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse. The flames were closing in around him. She turned and ran. She ran through the library, through the hall, dodging falling timber. The front doors were blocked by debris. She smashed a window with a chair and threw herself out onto the veranda, cutting her hands on the glass. She tumbled onto the grass and rolled away just as the library roof collapsed inward. Boom! A plume of sparks shot 100 feet into the air. The sound of the house dying was like a scream. Dinah and Seraphine ran to her, dragging her further back, away from the heat. "You fool," Dinah was crying, wiping soot from Eleanor's face. "You damn fool. I told you he was dead." Eleanor sat up. She watched the mansion burn. She watched the 12 bedrooms, the imported marble, the silk curtains, the ledger of sins, and the man who owned it all, turn into light and heat. There was no body to bury. There was no evidence to hide. The fire took everything. They sat there until dawn. When the sun rose, it illuminated a scene of total devastation. The Beaumont mansion was a smoking skeleton of brick chimneys and charred wood. The air smelled of wet ash. The enslaved community stood in silent circles. They weren't cheering. They were waiting. They knew that when a king dies, chaos follows. Dinah sat beside Eleanor on the grass. Her dress was ruined. Her face was black with soot. "What now?" Dinah asked quietly. "Master Charles is dead, but his brother, he lives in Virginia. He'll come. He'll claim the land. He'll claim us." Eleanor looked at her hands. They were burned, cut, and shaking, but they were free. "Charles's brother won't be here for weeks," Eleanor said. Her voice was raspy, damaged by the smoke. "News travels slow. Lawyers move slower." She looked at Dinah. "We have a head start." "We?" Dinah asked. "I told you," Eleanor said, standing up. She swayed dizzy, but she stayed upright. "I am going north, and I am taking anyone who wants to come." Dinah looked at the ruins. Then she looked at the open road leading away from the plantation. "Anyone?" Dinah asked. "I can't save everyone," Eleanor said, looking at the hundreds of people in the fields. "I don't have enough money. I don't have enough wagons, but I can save some. I can save you. I can save Seraphine. I can save whoever can run fast enough." Dinah stood up. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Then we better get moving," Dinah said, "before the white folks in town see the smoke." Eleanor Beaumont looked at the ashes of her life one last time. She felt no grief. She felt only a strange, terrifying lightness. The cage was melted. "Yes," Eleanor said, "let's go." She turned her back on the ruins and started walking toward the stables. She didn't look back. She had a promise to keep, and 1,000 miles to go. The weeks that followed the burning of the Beaumont estate were not recorded in any official history book. They were written in the dust of back roads and the whispers of safe houses. In the vacuum of power left by Charles's death, Eleanor didn't just run. She orchestrated a heist. Using the last of her jewelry, the diamonds she hadn't sold, the pearls she had sewn into her hem, she bought wagons. She bought silence. She bought passage. She didn't just take Dinah. She took 17 people. 17 souls who had been listed in Charles's ledger as property were now moving north under the cover of night, led by the woman who had once owned them. They moved like ghosts. Eleanor, the widow in mourning black, rode in the front wagon using her white skin as a shield. When patrols stopped them, she played the part of the grieving, confused aristocrat fleeing a tragedy. She lied with a coolness that would have made Charles proud. She forged papers. She bribed sheriffs. She used the very system that had oppressed them to smuggle them out. But the road to freedom is long, and it is paved with terror. They traveled for 4 months. They moved through the swamps of Mississippi, the pine forests of Tennessee, the frozen cornfields of Ohio. They slept in barns, in caves, in cellars beneath sympathetic churches. They were hunted. Bounty hunters were thick on the ground, sniffing for runaways like bloodhounds. They lost people. 2 men were captured near the Kentucky border. Eleanor couldn't save them. She had to watch from the shadows as they were chained and dragged back south, a silent scream trapped in her throat. 1 woman died of fever in a basement in Indiana. They buried her in an unmarked grave, shivering in the winter cold. But they kept moving, because behind them was fire and ahead of them was Elijah. March 1854. The wind coming off Lake Ontario was sharp enough to cut skin. Canada was not the paradise of milk and honey they had dreamed of. It was gray, cold, and hard. But the air tasted different. It tasted like no one else owned it. Eleanor stood on the muddy street of a small settlement outside Toronto. She was unrecognizable. The silk and lace were gone, replaced by rough wool and exhaustion. Her hands were chapped raw. Her face was thin, lined by the miles and the fear. She held a slip of paper with an address Dinah's network had provided. She walked up the wooden steps of a small carpentry shop. The sign above the door read simply, E. Freeman, Carpenter. She knocked. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that hadn't slowed down since Louisiana. What if he wasn't here? What if he had moved on? What if he had forgotten? 5 years is a lifetime. People change. Trauma changes them. The door opened. The smell of sawdust and fresh pine drifted out, the same smell from the workshed back home. A man stood there. He was older, there was gray in his beard now. He wore heavy work clothes, holding a planer in one hand. But the eyes, those dark, intelligent, weary eyes, they hadn't changed. Elijah looked at the woman standing on his doorstep. He looked at her worn clothes, her graying hair, the scars on her hands. He dropped the planer. It clattered to the floor. "Eleanor," he whispered. The name came out like a question, like he was afraid he was hallucinating. "I told you," she said, her voice cracking, tears instantly blurring her vision. "I told you I was coming." He didn't say a word. He crossed the threshold in one stride. He grabbed her, pulling her into him, burying his face in her neck. Eleanor collapsed against him, holding him with a desperation that defied gravity. They stood there in the doorway, in the freezing Canadian wind, weeping. They were two shipwrecks who had found the same shore. "You're real," he sobbed into her hair. "You're real." "We're free," she whispered back. "Elijah, we're free." They were married 3 weeks later. It wasn't a grand affair. There was no cathedral, no bishop, no governor's ball. It was a small ceremony in a wooden church, attended by Dinah, Seraphine, and a congregation of escaped slaves who understood the miracle they were witnessing. When the preacher asked for their names, Eleanor didn't say Beaumont. She dropped that name like a stone into the sea. She took his. Eleanor and Elijah lived in Canada for 34 years. It wasn't a fairy tale. Life was hard. They faced prejudice. Canada was free, but it wasn't perfect. They worked until their backs ached. Eleanor, the woman who had never boiled a kettle, learned to cook, to scrub, to mend. Elijah built houses for other free men, his hands creating shelter instead of wealth for a master. But it was their life. Every loaf of bread they broke was theirs. Every night they slept in the same bed was a victory. They had 3 children, children who were born free, children who never knew the sound of a whip or the weight of a chain, children who learned to read sitting on their father's lap, tracing the letters in books their mother wrote. Because Eleanor didn't stop writing. She published under a pseudonym, sending her stories back across the border. She wrote about the South. She wrote about the rot beneath the magnolia. She wrote about a fire that cleansed the earth. She became a voice in the abolitionist movement, a ghost haunting the conscience of the nation she had left behind. And Dinah found her own peace. She became a seamstress, her fingers stitching together a new life. She married a man from Kentucky who had run just like she did. She spent the rest of her days working for the network, helping new arrivals find food, shelter, and dignity. She remained Eleanor's fiercest friend until the end, 2 women bound by a secret that had burned a dynasty to the ground. Elijah outlived Eleanor by 4 years. She died in 1888 in the house he had built for her. She died holding his hand, the same hand she had touched in the rose garden 40 years earlier. After she passed, Elijah didn't retreat into silence. He finished a project they had started together. Behind their house, on a small plot of land, he planted a garden. He planted magnolia trees, but not for beauty. He planted a tree for every person they knew who hadn't made it, one for the girl who died in Indiana, one for the men caught in Kentucky, one for Sarah, one for little Grace, one for every name Eleanor had written in her ledger of sins before it burned. It was a garden of ghosts, a memorial to the forgotten. Back in Louisiana, the jungle reclaimed the Beaumont estate. The ruins of the mansion stood for decades, a blackened, skeletal scar on the landscape. The locals avoided it. They said it was haunted. They said if you stood there on a quiet night, you could hear the sound of a woman screaming, or perhaps the sound of a man and a woman whispering in the dark. It became a legend, a cautionary tale told by white families about the dangers of transgression, about what happens when order is defied. "Don't forget your place," they would say, pointing to the ivy-covered bricks, "or you'll end up like the Beaumonts." But in the quarters, and later in the homes of the free families who stayed in St. Helena, a different story was whispered. They didn't tell it as a tragedy, they told it as a victory. They spoke of the white woman who grew a spine. They spoke of the black man who refused to break. They spoke of the fire not as a disaster, but as a liberation. The ruins weren't a warning, they were a monument. They were proof that love is more powerful than law, that humanity is more fundamental than hierarchy, that some chains can be broken if you are willing to pull hard enough. And that sometimes, the only way to fix a broken world is to burn it down and start over. Eleanor and Elijah are gone now. The garden in Canada is overgrown. The ruins in Louisiana have crumbled to dust, but the story remains. It travels on the wind, a secret history of fear and freedom, reminding us that even in the deepest darkness, there are souls who will always find the light. This has been Legacy of Fear. If you are listening to this in the dark, hold your loved ones close. And remember, history isn't just what is written in books, it's what survives in the fire. Good night.